Underworld reinvented the monster genre and nobody noticed. Underworld reinvented the monster genre and nobody noticed. It's been nearly 20 years since the first Underworld film premiered in theaters, and despite the host of negative reviews, it earned just shy of $100 million, against a budget of only $22 million, sparking a new wave of action-based fantasy horrors. Headlined by Kate Beckinsale, who played the vampire Selene, the first Underworld movie sparked 3 continuing sequels, a prequel, an animated short film, comic books, and more. For a time, there were even talks of a television spin-off and a number of crossover films between Underworld and other projects such as Marvel's Blade, the Resident Evil series, and the often forgotten Frankenstein. Needless to say, there's a lot more to the Underworld universe than meets the eye, and the franchise's heavy cult following has kept it going for the better part of 2 decades. But although Underworld has remained an admittedly small part of our cultural zeitgeist, it's an impressive franchise that has continued to reinvent the monster wheel. Part of what makes the Underworld movies both interesting and compelling, especially in an age where all sorts of dark fantasy stories are told, is that the franchise takes the time to ground itself in a reality not too unfamiliar, one that ties myth and legend into both science and the events of history. As a co-production between film companies across Europe and the United States, the first Underworld did the unthinkable in combining the high-octane action sequences of a film like The Matrix with a Shakespearean world filled with vampires and werewolves, called Lycans in this reality, which is a much better name anyway. Created by director, producer Len Wiseman, writer Danny McBride, and Kevin Grevioux, who also played the Lycan Rays in the first film and its prequel, The Underworld series only got more intense with each new installment, building off the vast and rich history of this monster-infested world to tell a new and unique tale on every occasion. These flicks have been Romeo and Juliet-like love stories, revenge pictures, historical epics, mystical fantasies, gangster dramas, and even ventured into nigh superhero territory the more sequels they released. If the Underworld series has proven anything after all these years, it's that it can still surprise you. And it does so while telling one of the most unique monster stories out there. The ever-present conflict between the warring vampire and Lycan clans is the heartbeat of the Underworld story. The first film deals with Selene's struggle between her duty as a and quote, death dealer and quote, vampire assassins sent to dispatch Lycan warriors, and her love for Michael Corvin, a Scott Speedman-looking descendant of the original Alexander Corvinus, Derek Jacobi, the first of the Immortals and the father of the vampire and Lycan clans. As Michael begins his Lycan transformation, Selene is forced to make an impossible choice, and as she does so, she discovers the dark secrets behind her lineage and their reign of terror. The first 2 films, Underworld and its sequel, Underworld Evolution, only scratch the surface of what these well-organized criminal syndicates are capable of as the monster-on-monster violence continues, building into even bigger battles with larger stakes. While prequels in general have the potential to be underwhelming or even contradict the events of the originals, Underworld, Rise of the Lycans is arguably the best of the bunch as it goes above and beyond to shed light on the events of the first film. A truly standalone story, it exposes the class war between the imperialistic vampires, led by the ruthless Victor, Bill Nye, and their slaves, the always beaten down lichens who are eventually led out of slavery Exodus style by Lucien, Michael Sheen, who just so happens to be the antagonist of the original 2003 film. Though the lichens are generally portrayed in a villainous light by the other four pictures, Rise of the Lichens reverses the roles by establishing the vampires' unrepentant dominance and exposing their bloodthirsty work in the 15th century, while the Underworld series is not the first to establish dark histories between warring clans of monsters. Its groundbreaking approach to portraying both sides as the heroes and the villains depending on one's perspective is something to be commended, especially for a series of films so often maligned. No other vampire versus werewolf story has given each side their own voice quite like Underworld has. But no wonder, as the films establish that vampires and lichens come from the same source. In fact, these creatures aren't even deemed supernatural, rather their mutations are a result of a viral mutagen found in their ancestors, one who was bitten by a bat, the other bitten by a wolf. Vampires in particular rely heavily on scientific advancement to keep their race alive, while the lichens use more tribal means to spread their influence. Any fantastical additions are established later on, namely in the most recent installment, 2016's Underworld, Blood Wars. For the most part, the Underworld series takes place in our modern-day Europe, particularly in a version of our world that doesn't know anything about monsters, at least at first. In the years between Underworld Evolution and Underworld Awakening, humanity not only learns about the existence of vampires and lichens but does its best to hunt them down. The vampires, who had always retained political power of some sort, were no longer able to conceal their true nature from humanity. Likewise, the lichens became even more beastly than before, living off fewer scraps than they were used to and becoming bolder in the hunt. As the story continues, each side's tactics take interesting turns. Although Awakening is the only Underworld film that takes the time to acknowledge humanity's involvement in this shadow war, given that Blood Wars returns Underworld back to formula, the inclusion of characters like Detective Sebastian, Michael Ealy, and even Michael Corvin in the first film remind us that although this battle has been fought for centuries, humanity is still fragile by comparison. The human experimentation on vampires and lichens is also particularly fascinating, and elements of those procedures follow Selene and company into Blood Wars also. Needless to say, the almost gang-like factions of the